Hello and welcome to the Corruption Chronicles podcast. The podcast grew out of my book, The Happiest Corruption: Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California Beach Town. It's the story of the corruption I found when I was the mayor of my town, and you can now read it on Amazon. Before I introduce our guest, I wanted to recognize and thank our podcast host, LJ Stead of Purple Banter. Later in the podcast, he may have some questions, and so I'm hoping, LJ, if you have any questions, you'll jump in. Corruption Chronicles podcast tells stories of corruption and how everyday people are working to fix it. And I had come across our guest's pioneering work when I was researching for the Happy Corruption book, but it wasn't until Darryl, our guest today, found the book and started reading that we met. He texted me and I asked him if he would come on the podcast today to update us on the cannabis industry as it stands, but also to tell us his story. And Darryl Cotton is a political and social activist. He's the founder of 151 Farms, speaker, author of the Restoration Act. He's a researcher, a businessman, a pro se litigant, and he puts into action his life mission that urban farms really can help to change the world one garden at a time. His pioneering work in creating and developing closed-loop, constant-flow aquaponic methods of rock farming provides a working model tour for urban and social equity economic opportunities, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions while reducing plant water consumption to less than 5% of those traditional soils farms. Darryl's work creates jobs, provides housing, fights injustice in our laws, and through his Hand Up program, assists in providing alternative housing for the elderly, and that's his lasting gift to the world. So, wow, Darryl, I'm overwhelmed with that, but let's start by, could you start with explaining your aquaponic methods? Because I know that applies to a lot of your farming. You don't just do cannabis, but I know it applies to cannabis. Could you talk a little more about that?
Thank you. That was a very great introduction, Debbie. I hope I can live up to it. And that's for having me on the show. To answer your question, my background as electrical design and engineering brought me to the cannabis market when I started looking at artificial lights that would simulate sunlight and optimize plant growth indoors. So I personally have a relationship with cannabis as a medical cannabis patient, handling nocturnal seizures, and it really is effective. There's some strains that have kept me seizure free now for over 5 years. And up until then, I was learning the difference in cannabinoids and genetics that lend itself to non-opiate solutions that would not be really worse for me than the prescription drugs I was being prescribed at the time, hard on the liver and so on. So I've come up with cannabis strains that work for me personally. And since everybody's endocannabinoid system is different, you have to do a little of your own research. There's a lot of information out there, but it's really trusting the farm too, and knowing that you're getting those genetics over and over and over. So what I'm seeing recently are, an advance in these synthetic designer drugs such as K2 and Spice, and they're putting that on cannabis. You're not likely to see that coming out of a licensed dispensary because they are testing for that. And the street level cannabis that you'll get, unless you know the farm, oftentimes people are looking at that cannabis and they want it actually treated with those synthetic opiates so that they can get those hallucinogenic highs that don't come with naturally grown cannabis, or to the extent that you normally don't get that. So that's the condition that we find ourselves in today between licensed and unlicensed. Personally, after 40 years of being on organically grown cannabis, I have found that my message originally started out was the energy savings to try to grow these plants indoors so more people could do that. But then I started looking at the water conservation methods, and that's where 151 Farms evolved. And that literally stands for a pound of cannabis, 5 pounds of food for one community. So it became somewhat of a social engineering enterprise in that we wanted to take control as small communities go, to know what we were growing for traditional crops. Cannabis is one of those cash crops, as well as hops, quite a few other crops that would lend itself to growing it for the economic benefits too. But wow, what we're saying today with the drought, I mean, if you look at a drought map and you look at California, we're 80% in a D2, D3, and even D4, we're about 25%. So these are severe
Mm.
water conditions that are going to affect everybody. And as fate would have it, you're looking at what's going on in Europe and the Netherlands, for example, all over though, where they're looking at the soils and saying, hey, there's too much nitrogen, and we're going to start pulling back the farmland permits. And now 50% of the agricultural crops are being reduced. It's not going to be long before that hits the United States because much of our fertilizers, our nitrogen-based fertilizers, come from Europe and Russia. So with this cataclysmic circumstances that we're facing for traditional food crops, it was important to come up with something that originally I did for just urban environments, and that was closed loop aquaponics, as you just described. And really all that is aquaculture. It's fish water feeding plants. But what I started looking at is how can we keep down the evaporative losses? And this goes to what I've developed called closed loop constant flow aquaponics, where the water constantly flows between the plants and the fish tanks. And by doing that, you're always bringing oxygenated water to the plant roots, and it's flowing past it much like it would be in a riverbed, where the constant flow of a river over the rocks creates these lush, green, healthy plant environments to the sides of them. So knowing how that works, knowing the size of the plants, the quality of the plants that we've seen in Hawaii with lava rock, I incorporated that, and I kept the water lines about 2 inches below the rock. So there's virtually no evaporative losses. And by just controlling the water flow, you can look at our website, 151farmers.org, or join me on Facebook, because this is a lot of information, but it's all there, as well as in our media links, downloads, and how we've incorporated things like you said earlier, hand up. Well, a lot of old people are just warehoused in old folks' homes, nursing homes, and they don't really have a purpose in life. What we've been able to do is take people that have a will to get up and get out and incorporate them getting out every day, helping feed the fish, doing anything necessary to bring them a sense of purpose. And it's extended their lives and improved the quality of lives to the extent that a lot of people that have had their family members come here are just really glad that they did, because it's given them a whole new purpose on life. So that's where 151 Farms stands for today. And now, if you have any questions, please bring them forth. But that's kind of an overview.
Yeah, I do. I want to interrupt you for a second because there were three things really that were really interesting to me. And the first one was going back to the unlicensed cannabis, that there's still a lot being grown out there that is unofficial or black market cannabis. And you mentioned that it was being laced with opiates, the cannabis itself.
Synthetic opiates, and it's commonly referred to as new psychoactive substances, or NPS for short. And what that is would be synthetic cannabinoids that the way they spray them on, it'll be an irregular dosage. But, when the young people are clubbing and stuff, they want that high. They want that psychoactive high that standard cannabis may offer. But obviously, with the changing amounts of delta-9 THC, the psychoactive part of cannabis, they're going to see that in irregular doses. So this really supercharges cannabis and brings it to a whole new club level experience. And actually, we've seen it laced with fentanyl and other drugs as well. So the addictive characteristics of cannabis in its natural form are practically non-existent. It's a psychological addiction, if anything. But and I'm no medical expert, but I do know that based on the genetics I've grown over the years, and especially now that I'm growing them strictly aquaponically, it is like the canary in the coal mine. You cannot put anything on that plant that will harm the fish. So in my system, you'll never have a heavy metal nutrient or insecticide, fungicide, or aericide to go on the plant that would harm the fish. So this whole ecosystem has to be in balance and homogeneous. And to those that want to get into this, I strongly encourage them to do. I have not protected anything here. It's all published on my website on how to build it. And the idea is to be able to do this without making the mistakes I made in discovering how to do it, so that you can incorporate this in areas where water is becoming the new oil. It's a extremely
so it absolutely is. And so what you're saying is you have a system. I wonder if you could just describe it. It's a fish tank.
Yes.
And it goes to plants.
Correct.
And it circulates between them.
Yes, because the fish will release in their urine high amounts of ammonia that's immediately transition into a nitrite. So nitrites flow through the water and they end up in these rock beds that I've created out of standard 275 gallon IBC totes. But I've made these to scale too. I mean, I've had hoop houses 300-foot long that have a series of these tubs in them, and it's just pond liner that allows you to lay the rock in them. As long as the water's flowing in one end and leaving the other, it's going to circulate through that rock and demineralize over time the minerals that are locked in the rock, as well as the ammonia gets into a nitrite state, moves into the rocks, and in there is beneficial bacteria that eats nitrites and poops out nitrates. Plants take up nitrates. So that's the symbiosis that occurs naturally. We call it the nitrification cycle. And it's so simple. It reminds me of what the Egyptians were doing some 6,000 years ago when they were moving water. And if we step back and look at what they did and how they did it, and model that. The only other thing we have to add is plants to it. And what drives our economies right now could go back to agricentric skill sets that we can teach children and those that are needing employment from entry level all the way to advanced degree. I work with UC Davis on this because one of the things their ag department sees is this is a global food condition that we have to address. And as long as I can capture rainwater, I can have a completely standalone system that runs on solar energy to run a little 1/2 horsepower pump. We're just pushing water to one end and bringing it back to the fish. And we're literally, it's scalable. So you can double and triple the amount of water in the fish tank by keeping that water moving constantly between the plant tubs and the fish tanks. Does that make
So
sense?
what's the volume can you do with this? I mean, obviously you could use it in your living room. I'm guessing with a small tank, but what volume are you able to produce with this?
Well, realistically, like if a group of neighbors got together, you could have a couple of rock tubs in each residential backyard and then feed it from a fish tank that just was in the home of one of your neighbors. So you're really just moving the nutrient-rich fish water over to the rock tubs and then back to the fish. Obviously, you'd want to have some access to those tubs too. But the two distinct portions are the fish tank and the rock tubs. And the rock tubs are basically IBC totes filled with this highly uh, porous rock. It's called black lava rock, but I use a number of different rocks because as you have water rolling over it, you're constantly demineralizing it. And I've got avocados, tomatoes, oranges, you name it. I mean, the size of these plants are enormous, and I hardly use any water. That water is in a
So,
lot.
so that sounds like it would work for, backyard gardens, but does it actually work in farming? Can
Oh yeah,
you go,
there,
use it for a whole greenhouse or
oh,
how?
I would encourage it because if you see the size of my cannabis plants here, I'm a medical cannabis patient. I grow these for myself. I completely am at odds with the state and how they're trying to regulate cannabis through Proposition 64 and Senate Bill 94. Those were enacted, well, Prop 64 was enacted in November.
Yeah, I want to get to those
But
in a
we have to
second.
take
Yeah.
control of what we're putting in our bodies. And some of these laws make you a criminal by trying to abide by the laws. So to answer your question, large scale projects definitely fit into this because we have to show people, and they should be incentivized with water and energy savings programs to adopt these systems as opposed to tapping the limited resources we still have left.
So what's the scoop with UC Davis? Did you say you mentioned UC Davis? They've
Yeah.
adopted your program?
151 Farms is named in a USDA grant. It's on my website. There's a number of academics there that have looked at it and seen the water savings techniques, but the organically grown side of it's extremely important too. So a lot of people that might have conditions that would be affected by the residual pesticides, fungicides, aericides, or even nutrients uh, would really be creating a situation that's not conducive to good health
Yeah.
and with a compromised immune system become a real problem. So nothing about an organically grown plant is identifiable to those that have been buying from your local Vons or Albertsons, okay? Because those plants are actually curing or coming to fruition while they're in transit and sitting on the shelves. An organically grown plant probably won't have the same size, but it's going to taste entirely different. And that goes with our hops, which we use for our breweries, cannabis the same way. And it's just a delight to see
Mhm.
the symbiosis between happy fish. When your fish are happy in a well-balanced system, they're mating, they're eating, they're active. We have koi, we have tilapia. Another co-cultivation opportunity is tilapia. So it's a shame that these things aren't being adopted on a wider scale. But you know something, based on where we see Lake Mead and other places right now, UC Davis recognizes it. Others are starting to recognize it, and they just have to leave their bias at the gate and come in and understand how these systems work.
Yeah. Wow. So that leads to another question. Well, I wanted to go back also to the synthetic cannabinoids. Are the licensed producers actually using that? It
No,
sounds illegal.
well, it's not really because much of this comes is a hemp derivative, like Delta 8 is a hemp
Mm,
derivative. Delta 9 is what's controlled and regulated. And the laws are fuzzy on this too, which is another reason, I got into this as not only a political activist, but a legal activist when I sued the state of California and Attorney General Bonta over Prop 64 and Senate Bill 94, which propagates that. And you've created two different classes of cannabis now. Admittedly, Proposition 215, which was medical only, done in like I think 1996, if memory serves me. Anyway, where we started to see those laws come on board, there were zero regulations, very few that limited who could get a medical card or why. So that became the third rail of politics. They wouldn't create these regulations. Senate bill, or starting with Prop 64, they claimed it was the first time they were taxing cannabis and going to make it quote unquote safe. This is all untrue. I mean, we've been taxing cannabis since 2007 through the Board of Equalization. So we were forced into AMA, and as patients, we should have been tested for pesticides, heavy metals, and all these things, but they said they couldn't do it. We didn't have a Bureau of Cannabis Control or Department of Cannabis Control. We had a group that would sit there and say, oh, no, it's still federally illegal, so we can't get FDA or EPA levels of what's considered toxic to a patient. So up until AMA in 2016, those departments didn't exist, and there was no testing, mandatory testing being done for it. So we have some good that came of Prop 64, but the good does not outweigh the bad. And we need to go back to what's considered federally compliant medical cannabis laws too. Let's not forget that. We're still in a positive conflict with the federal government over cannabis in the state.
So, what do you know? One of the things I tried at one point to get was to figure out how much cannabis is actually is grown and where it's grown, because I hear stories that it's everywhere and a lot of it gets shipped out of state. And when I went, you can any crop, and Davis is really UC Davis is very involved in this. With any crop, you can find out how much is produced, what it's sold for, the total volume for the year, the total taxes for the year, the total sales dollars, all of that. For cannabis, maybe you'll find out what the taxes were, and I think they were roughly 5 billion. Um, but it was kind of scary to me that there really doesn't seem to be any regulation at all on
Now,
the cannabis.
you're right. It's Katie bar the door. And when we looked at things like CEQA, we got into AMA, Adult Use of Marijuana Act, and the voters were narrowly approving that, by the way. I think it was a
Yes.
53 to 46% go. And so the voters bought into a lot of the celebrities who didn't know beans about what it is they were uh, advocating for, but it's progressive cannabis law, let's call it that. And let's look at what it actually did. Well, it's supposed to protect the environment through CEQA, which is the California Environmental
Hmm.
Quality Act. And, as a mayor, former mayor, and involved with city councils, you would say, hey, that's a great thing. But did you have the resources at a local government level to really manage these things? Did you know what cannabis draws in terms of water per square meter per acre? And what the cycles were, how many times a year you could expect these demands on your ecosystems, and what the environmental impacts were going to be? Of course not. So what you
Well,
have,
I have to tell you, actually, we knew some of that. We knew the water. I know that PG&E was worried about the power demands,
good.
and but nobody cared.
No, because there's this rush.
Really,
There's this
there
rush,
were some limitations on it, but nobody really cared. They
and
wanted the money.
they wouldn't listen either. So I looked at it and I said, you're not going to stop this freight train until it becomes to civil litigation. and public integrity units and what we're seeing on local government corruption to pass these pay-to-play cannabis licensing schemes is systemic. It's up and down the state, and it's your book details it beautifully, which is why I'm so happy to see you having done it. And I would hope there's others, but has it? Let me ask you: has it really made a difference today in what we're seeing in local government in SLO? Having published that book?
Oh, no, I
No,
don't think so.
no.
But it's only been out for a month, and
What do they fear? What do they fear?
so
What?
we'll see what happens. I think what it has done is it has brought to people's attention the depth and breadth of it. Even people who were aware when they read the book say they had no idea. They had just no idea it was as much as it is. And I only put half of it in the book. And since the book, I've come across folks like you who've been telling me what's going on, and I'd say I've got another third more. So um, I don't think it's made a difference yet, but I think my consolation is, and this was my only consolation when I was in office, if I can do something, if I can make something change for the better, and if the book alerts a few people, um, it's better than it was before.
I,
Although, unfortunately, the bad guys work a lot more quickly and more efficiently than the good guys because they don't care whether it's legal or not. So it's a struggle. It's tough. But let me ask on, we know that there's well, we're told by the state that there's about $5 billion produced, I believe probably in 20 or 21. So what do you think is the actual amount being produced illegally compared to the legal market, the licensed market?
Let me address that, but before we lose track of where we were, so you're familiar with the Brown Act. You know that there's this sword of Damocles that's hanging over any public official
It's
that
a
is
Sunshine Act. Yeah.
sunshine.
Open government,
And
transparency.
I have not found that to be too successful. I mean, it's one of those things that it's out there, rarely used, and when used, it's like, they'll deal with it at a lower level, but it never really corrects the systemic problems that exist in uh, those pay-to-play schemes that are so prevalent up and down the state. And I looked at LA, what happened with the Councilman Louis Huzar, I think his name was, and all. So yes, they do get caught, and the FBI will raid their homes. The mayor of Adelanto, for example, and you had an Adam Hill situation here where he was held up to federal investigation. So things can happen from it. But I am of the belief, and this is why I sue government, is that if you sue them through the discovery process, you're going to learn more. Okay. They don't like
Hmm.
it. It's going to wear them down. And you're not going to find lawyers to do this. That's why I end up
No.
having to do it as a pro se or self represented litigant. Did I want to do this? Hell no. I'm happy in my farm and just doing what I'm doing. But I can't let this happen for other generations. So by doing a civil lawsuit against the government, you'll be asking for a peremptory writ of mandate or a petition for a writ of mandate. A writ of mandate is the courts telling the government they got to fix something, which can lead then to class actions. And a lot of people who have been harmed do have legitimate cases that can be brought forth if you see that you're on a successful track. But how do we know we're on a successful track unless the judiciary is publishing publicly the cases and all of the activities associated with those cases? And SLO's horrible. And there's others that do not publish the cases. So you
No.
can't, even if you're a lawyer, you can go in and look at your case, but then it times out and even you can't get it. So what are they hiding? My hope and prayer, and I know you've been talking to Krista and others, is that they start to lobby for a writ of mandate to get the judiciary and SLO to publish these court records so people can see them and you can build on that. And you can track your own cases too. Until that happens, they have nothing to fear because the judiciary is just as much involved.
Interesting.
That's my
Um,
now.
yeah, that's not something I was aware of.
No, you
So,
didn't. And I can only tell you this because I got interested in SLO when I started tracking Adam Hill and supposed suicide that was first by gunshot and then by an overdose. And there's a lot of things that bothered me about that. I got in touch with Eric Hughes, had long conversations with him, got to meet Krista and Anna Gabriel and others up there. So here in San Diego, all I can do is post it on my website and then let it wait until such time that it evolves and we can start talking about it. And when I looked at the CDFA, which is the California Department of Food and Agriculture, making deals around SLO County with an unlicensed farm, Lowell Farms, and I saw that $500,000 get spent. So when I talked to your district attorney up there, I forget the gentleman's name, but it's on my website. And I
Dan
said,
Dow.
that's
Hmm.
him. I said, are you aware that this deal got made with an unlicensed cannabis cultivator in SLO? and they're allowed to continue to operate with this $500,000 payment. And he said, no, at a minimum, you should have been filing another lawsuit against these people for not being licensed. I mean, otherwise, what is ALMA and all these laws really doing? Well, what it's doing is it's allowing pay-to-play corruption to exist and unlicensed growers to exist who are paying law enforcement and government to not go to the state and pay these exorbitant tax rates, which if you look at the federal level, they're not deductible. IRS 280E doesn't let you deduct it. I would much rather be an unlicensed cultivator in today's cannabis world, our industry, because I am not burdened by those same things that the licensee is. So to answer your question, how much of that exists? It's phenomenal. We've overproduced cannabis. We've overextended our resources to do so, and the prices are falling precipitously. There is no way you make money today as a licensee unless you're pushing cannabis products out the back door and or screwing over fellow licensees by not paying them. And we're seeing a lot of that.
Oh boy.
I know.
Wow.
We
Wow.
need to hit
Now,
reset.
I've heard that other places, but not as graphically.
Yeah, no, it's I hate to be the bearer of bad news, and I love this plant. You know what? Thankfully, it's not going to take a lot to fix this. My petition for writ of mandate forces the courts, which I don't expect at a lower superior court level they're going to do, issue that and tell the state through the Department of Justice that they have to undo 64 and go back to medical. But if you look at the dynamics between state and federal law, especially considering all the other things that are going on in federal law with everything that's going on with state rights and federalist law. So we have to take a hard look at what cannabis laws were enacted in 216 and how they purposely and deliberately ran contrary to federal law. And that's the essential foundational argument, is that we are in positive conflict with federal law, which falls under the Supremacy Clause, which then starts to make 14th Amendment violations to people like me and thousands of others throughout California that have been affected by that law, which is we call adult use.
So I still haven't really been able to wrap my head around what your court case is. I've looked at it and I've engaged on Facebook a little bit. I wonder if you can explain what the problem is. I know that you don't like 64 and you feel like it has created a bias against medical marijuana, but I'm not really understanding how that works.
Sure. And the federal government's position in all this is they're going to have a supreme law over state law. So when two matters conflict, it falls under the Supremacy Clause, and the higher court's interpretation of that law will be what stands. Now, here we are as medical cannabis patients and cultivators. We're at an intersection, and there's a light hanging over the center of the intersection and one here to our right. The one in the center intersection is red. The one at the right, lower to our right, is going to be green. Which one do we follow? Well, theoretically, and this isn't a hypothetical situation, you're always going to follow higher federal law, which states through the budget acts, and this goes back to a Rohrabacher or Farr amendment in 2014, that protected the medical cannabis patient in states that medical cannabis was compliant. Those regulations were in place, and that cultivator was compliant with those laws. So they were defunded. The Department of Justice was defunded from prosecuting those cases. It gave us some protections. We are in legal jeopardy when those protections are removed. So Prop 64 removes them in adult use and says, hey, we're that green light. You're going to go ahead and get licensed for adult use, whether you like it or not, or we're going to raid you. We're going to arrest you. We're going to seize all your products. We're going to lien your property for all the costs associated with that. And these are precisely the things that happened to me. I'm a 62-year-old white guy. What makes you think some 40-year-old African-American or a multi-generational farmer is not going to be hit with this and not have the time, money, energy, or resources to protect themselves and actually go on the offensive and say, what you're doing here is wrong? Justice Clarence Thomas in Akimbo cited it. There's numerous case laws that set a stare decisis level of interpretation for these laws. It's just getting a lower superior court judge to deny it, which he probably will, because who's my competition? Who's the respondent in my matter? It's the Department of Justice, who they work for. Okay, so of course they're going to deny it through a demurrer. I'll take it to appeal. I'll take it to the California Supreme Court, and then we get into the federal courts. I might get it at any level in the California courts because the arguments are so powerful. But of course, the DOJ doesn't see it that way. And
So are you saying the issue then, the problem is that before Prop 64, you could grow your medical marijuana, you could you could produce medical marijuana without being licensed. And the federal government, while they were still saying it was illegal, had defunded going after anybody, so nobody was chased down for it.
right, because
But
there
now,
are 18 states for
now
adult use
it
now.
has to be licensed, and
Right.
so they go after you if you don't have a license.
It's a tax scheme. So it's adult use in 18 other states, not just California. So these arguments that I'm making apply through all states. When a state legislature, because this happened in the Texas abortion case, and Chief Justice Roberts even said in his opinion that state legislatures must not purposely contradict federal law, or you're undermining the authority of the Supreme Court, which is absolutely true. And we have other interesting cases recently, Roe v. Wade and stuff, where we're going back to state control over abortion rights. Okay, but what about immigration? What about cannabis law? We have to look at this all in its totality. The legislatures cannot be making laws that purposely violate higher federal law and put us in legal jeopardy of federal prosecution, which is very real. It might not being enforced right now because there's this lax attitude at DOJ, but the law and what Congress said in Rohrabacher-Farr all the way through Section 531 of our 2022 House budget, which protects medical cannabis, but not adult use. So that's, if you look in my case, and these hyperlinks are all there, you find me on Facebook and you can go to I don't use GoFundMe anymore because anything that goes after a legal defense fund, they shut you down. So there's Give, Send, Go, a new fundraising, crowdsourced funding I'm using. I did put it up there. I put links to the case, the relative case filings.
So are you advocating that medical marijuana should not need to be licensed? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not for that at all. We have something called the Restoration Act, which is taking the best of what Prop 64. I mean, I love the environmental controls supposedly that got put in with Prop 64, but are they in fact being used? Hell no. The first thing is, and you said this earlier, how much cannabis is being grown in this state versus how many people are buying it? They don't have these modeled yet. They don't know that. There's some broad assumptions, but the reality is we have to know how many licenses are being issued for how many square foot acres, and then know that that's not exceeding what the perceived client demand would be. And honestly, there's another whole aspect of this too, is the government doesn't seem to care. They put these CEQA permits on hiatus, and they didn't enforce them. So here it is, 2022. It's been going on 6 years, and they're just now starting to enforce CEQA. Well, what if I've already invested hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars into my farm, and now I'm not CEQA compliant, right? Have you ever heard of such a thing? I mean, this is nonsense.
Yeah, I have, unfortunately.
So that's why I started the lawsuit, and I expect, and I am not giving up until I find a court that's willing to issue the writ of mandamus and bring the state into compliance with federal law.
So let's go. I want to go back to the medical cannabis and where people can find safe cannabis. I know at one point I had some friends who also were very dedicated to medical cannabis, and I needed some for pain, and I wanted a topical one, and I had a friend whose mother needed some. And my biggest thing when I was on the council, the most important thing to me about licensing cannabis was that I wanted it to be safe. For the people who really needed it medically, I wanted to make sure that it didn't contain any of the heavy metals, pesticides, illegal substances, who knows what. I wanted some regulation so that it was actually safe and consistently produced for people who needed it medically. And so I asked my friends when I wanted some for pain, where can I get one? What's the safest one? And they struggled to find one that they felt good about. But one of the things they said to me is a lot of it comes from China. In China, there are the heavy metals. There's absolutely no regulation, and you definitely don't want hemp or cannabis coming from China.
No.
But of course, who knows where it comes from? So,
well, to your point, I think what we go back to is organically grown. So if we have the inputs that are being left in the finished product, that's going to go in your body. And is the testing actually accurate? Well, it's a profit-driven industry. So if I got a lab that's not reporting what I want them to report, then I'm going to find another lab, and that we see a lot of that. So these results can be skewed to favor the cultivator so that it can meet the market, because the 12 panel tests, or maybe there's even more now, I don't know, they're showing things that we never showed prior to the passage of OMA. And that's a good thing. I want to know what's in our cannabis, but I
Hmm.
don't trust the farmers and I really don't trust the labs. So in the Restoration Act, we address that. We're saying, it's trust but verify. And we want to know as
Yes.
consumers what's going in our bodies. And this is one way to do it. As an organically grown crop, I am not going to have the yield per square foot or square meter that a hydroponic garden would have, where there's all these chemical inputs. Is it properly flushed though when it goes to harvest? Hardly ever, because that's time consuming and you want to get that to market. Has it been properly cured? So you talked about essential oils and what happens when we use the distillate process. All those things are carried over for the most
Yeah.
part in the essential oils, but to a higher percentage. So I don't want to make any kind of essential oil, and it's a wide variety of spectrums. It's much like aspirin. We don't know how it works, but it works. You can talk about individual cannabinoids and profile what that can be expected to do, but when you start putting together this symphony of cannabinoids and how it affects you individually, that's something that's done on a case by case basis. So we want to make sure that when we're treating with people with these varieties, this entourage of cannabinoids, that we don't overdo it. So we start them out low. But once we start getting into this, I can say with about a 75 to 80% success rate, quality of life benefits have improved. And topicals, like one of our hand up people here, his name was Jimmy. He's since passed away from COVID, but he had necrosis and they were going to amputate the leg. I started putting a topical on it, and within days, the doctors couldn't believe it. It was starting to heal. So our cannabinoid systems, endocannabinoid systems, have been denied the cannabinoids that they need for homeostasis. Okay, we have to try to reintroduce that, and we're doing that in combination with UC Davis. We're using moringa and other high antioxidant plants to do that and create a higher quality or better quality of life than we have without it, and through the processed foods, which increases obesity and high blood pressure and a myriad of other issues. So coming back to our farms and taking control of it in a posse comitatus status. I mean, this is literally our farm. And what we have here is a community that grows these products and understands what from those products we will be able to put in our bodies.
So, for the average person who needs medical marijuana for any variety of things that it helps with, how do they know they're getting safe product, and where do they get safe product?
It depends on how they're taking it. If they're going to a licensed dispensary, then they can see lab results. If you're going to a known farmer, licensed or not, that values the crop quality, then you can be reasonably assured that they're doing a good job. If you're not getting headaches, for example, starting out with smoking and you're starting to get headaches from that, chances are there's some residual heavy metals and nutrients that haven't been washed. Um, but this is, again, a profit driven business. So people want to get 30 plus grams per square foot. They're going to amp those plants up with as many nutrients as they can. And as we can see with what's a lot of our nutrients, our nitrogen comes out of fossil fuels from Russia, that's going to increase the cost of that 500 times here with by the end of
Yeah.
the year. It's just going through the roof. And what's that going to affect? Our food, everything. So what we're talking about here is a whole house fix. Okay. And I have on my website something, we all know the problems. What are the solutions? And our government has failed us miserably in terms of homelessness, jobs, exporting our technologies and all that. And I think we can get a lot of that back through agricentric skill sets, but we have to get busy doing it because we're running out of water.
Yeah. Um, another thing that One of the other things that just blew my mind was that we know that cash passing through various hands
Yep.
is the way that a lot of criminal activity happens. It's the one chain that you can't keep tabs on. And even so, marijuana businesses were not able to use the banking system because many of the banks were federal. And so it actually, in my opinion, made it more likely, and certainly um, we saw it in our own county, that there would be even more corruption because folks had to use, it was a cash-based industry. So I understand that's changed a bit. Do you know, can you tell us a little more about what's happening now? Can marijuana companies now use banks? Is there some way they can bank their money,
No, the
their
FDIC
proceeds?
is a very conservative group, and if you have overt connections to cannabis, you're likely to get your bank account shut down. So I don't do anything other than hemp strains, which are low in THC, less than 0.3%, and I do that in combination with my hops and microgreens and everything else as a working farm that shows people who want to come in and tour what they can do. Okay, to any scale imaginable, almost anywhere in the world. Now, when you have to transact only in cash, as with cannabis, what that's allowing to do is pay to play corruption to exist in our local governments. And there's a growing body
Mm,
of government entities looking into this. They don't make it public, and I can't say much about it, but I can tell you that those government officials who have been collecting those sacks of money for all these years are going to be exposed. And if not, then it happens where the federal government, for whatever reason, won't take on these cases. There's the civil actions that are going to come from this, and we're going to expose these people. But I'd love to see more of this going on in counties like SLO. But until you can make your judiciary publish every filing and all the registers of action that go with those cases, I feel sorry for even the uh, not the defendants, but the claimants. What do they say? Plaintiffs. So when you're a plaintiff and you have co-plaintiffs, you guys want to be able to track your cases, and you can't do that in SLO. And there's a few other little counties. In this day and age, there's no reason that any of the counties in the state of California can't show plaintiffs and co-plaintiffs what it is exactly going on in their case and related cases. That's where they do hide the P. It happens with Krista Koenig and others up there in SLO. We have to question our government. We have to hold them accountable, as you know.
absolutely.
And this is the only way through the judiciary, the third leg of this governmental stool of ours, that we can manage to do that. And until those cases are public, we're at a decided disadvantage. So about the cash side of it, though, look, a lot of governments are going all digital. You saw what just happened with Bitcoin and everything else. But with cannabis, it's not going to go digital until it's federally legal. And do you see that happening anytime soon? I don't. Political will is not there. So as much as they want to go to a digital currency, it's crops like cannabis that are going to maintain these corrupt activities through the transactions of cash. There's no way around it. I believe cash has a value anyway, but it's losing its value in terms of its worth, whereas something like cannabis and precious metals, they'll maintain a value that cash will not.
You know, one of the things that you had mentioned once before when we'd had a conversation was that the tax dollars that are being paid into the state are being funneled into trusts because they're not federally legal, so they can't use it in the general fund. So correct me if I'm not repeating this correctly. And so, but none of us know, we can't. Can you talk more about that? Explain
Yeah,
what's the issue with the
okay,
trusts?
so when I looked at the League of California Cities and others that would represent the solutions for local government control, tax, and regulation, you would think that at a local level, a lot of governments aren't prepared to issue, cannabis regulatory regimes. So you go to a lobbyist consultant such as HDL, one of the biggest, and they'll say, don't worry, we'll set it all up. It won't cost you anything. We'll get our returns off of the audits. We'll take 40% of the audits or something. I'm just paraphrasing what I've heard. So a lot of local governments abandon their regulatory duties and assign it to a third party like an HDL. And then they're profit driven. So they have to understand that their money's going to come from the audits. And these audits are not cheap. They'll come into, at a minimum, when you look at a single claim value of $30,000 and you got penalties and interest on top of that, and your license is dependent on you paying that, so you're going to get it paid. That is going to be rife with fraud, rife with the potential for taking advantage of the licensees. But the licensees should be asking, where is all this money ending up in Sacramento? And for that, you have to look back at AMA, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. And there was language in there that said it will stand independent of the general fund. So all money for licensing, enforcement, collection, all these activities paid in cash go into special trust funds. My understanding is the special trust funds are in the hundreds now, and each one is up to $11 million each, where they do not have to disclose the beneficiary. So, like most things, you follow the money. And I believe when I first mentioned this to you, you weren't aware of that. You thought that this was being audited and we knew what this was generating, but it's not. It's outside of the general fund. And where that's Gavin Newsom's piggy bank. That's probably what put Kamala Harris in DC. All right. And it continues to go unabated and unchecked. And this is the language that the voters approved, as well as the 2/3 majority that could change the initiative at any time during the initiative while it was passed. Okay. So that's
And the
super,
voters had no idea
no
what
idea.
that meant.
And
It sounds good.
I think that needs
So
to be challenged too in its constitutionality. So that's a periphery issue as far as I'm concerned for right now, but it certainly should be challenged.
so I want to go back to one other thing that was raising red flags. You said that you'll get a company that, and I know our city did this. You'll get a company like HDL, which we did, that goes in and they run the whole tax side of it. So the city really, as you say, delegates it to somebody else. And and are you saying that HDL is also the company that audits the
Yes.
cannabis businesses?
Yes, that's how they pitch it. I mean, I don't know what relationship they made with Grover Beach or in Slow, but what they'll typically do is make it extremely reasonable. They'll be taking the burden of constructing something you know virtually nothing about. You have, no blueprints for this. Then there's your relationship with Sacramento too, which is somewhat ill-defined. So the way I got into some civil lawsuits is because if you'd been sanctioned within 3 years of applying for a new license under post-ALMA law, you were not eligible. Okay, it's clear in our business and professions codes 26057 that you were ineligible until 3 years elapsed. Most of these guys that are involved in pre-ALMA cannabis are criminals. They've got some criminal background, some things hanging around their neck that didn't make them applicably compliant. Okay, so if the application would be submitted and come up that they'd been sanctioned, that application should be denied. So what do they do instead? They issue proxies, straw people to stand on their behalf. And that's when you start looking at your local governments and say, do your land use regulations, are they really intact when you're offering areas in your community that could be, zoned agriculture or retail dispensary for cannabis, and you're allowing a proxy to stand in when right behind that proxy is the criminal that was probably paying you cash up until ALMA passed. And that's what we're seeing a lot of. The pay to play corruption extends into licensed just by the use of a proxy. Now, when that proxy served their purpose, they have a situation. They either buy the proxy out, that's very rare. They tell the proxy to just leave, turn the value of the dispensary, for example, over to the people that had financed it originally, or they're murdered. And that happens quite a
Yeah.
bit. They call it suicide, but if you look at the medical examiner reports more and more, and I have a case, one of our related cases is Amy Sherlock. Her husband was Michael Biker Sherlock. He started the X Games. And it's astonishing when you look at the medical examiner report. They can't find the casing, it's in the wrong hand. The shot went straight through the neck forward. I mean, your hand holds a gun to the right. It just goes on and on. And it's immediately ruled as suicide. They cremate the body, and there's nothing more that comes of it. But what happened to the license? It went back to the criminals. So it's not something that we can stand by and watch happen, Debbie. Your book goes a long way to exposing that. I think there's questions to be asked about Adam Hill and others. Helios is going to be doing a little bit of time for what he got involved with. But at the end of the day, unless we make fundamental changes to the law, this is going to continue to occur.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so huge. You've mentioned so many things that need to be looked at. And I I'm thinking, how do we do this? And but I know how we do it. And that's what the book is about. That's what the happiest corruption is about. The way we do it is the way you're doing it. It's when individuals get involved with their own set of skills, abilities, gifts, and use those as part of being we the people in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But unless the people are involved, they are going to get ripped off.
And
And
the
right
average
now,
person, if I would say they have to read your book, get educated as to what's going on because your fears are real. You just got to realize them, and then be prepared to do a declaration. If you've been harmed, you're going to have to stand in line and give us a declaration sworn as to what happened, when, where, and who. And with that, it's actionable. But if it's not, don't go online and just complain. You have to do something about it, and we have to have a judiciary where we can expose the day-to-day activities of what's going on in those courts, because I don't trust the judges.
hmm, wow.
You?
Well, I'm not sure I do either in every case
Yeah.
or in several cases. So, Darryl, tell folks again where they can go to get more information.
My 151 Farms website is good. If you hit me up on Facebook, uh, I have my main profile, but I have another group called Very Public. What I find in a lot of the Facebook groups is when they're private, they're talking to a closed audience of all like mine. So Very Public's designed to talk about these things and let anybody interested know that to make these changes, we have to work together. We can't be divided, because a house divided is what they'll conquer.
Yeah, that is the biggest secret, absolutely the biggest secret to get anything done. If you're seeing corruption, is you've got to work together with other people who are passionate about fixing it. And that has to be your first priority, because as soon as you start getting worried about diversity, diversity of any kind, diversity, financial diversity, racial diversity, gender diversity, yes, but even political diversity, you have to let all of that go and be passionate about fixing the corruption that's there, because in the end we are a village and villages are diverse, and that's the only way we can work together is if we work together and we set aside the diversity.
You're here. I mean, well said, and that does encompass our like-minded goals. So I would like to just end with one other element of this. So what do we do about the local governments? I do think there's too many local governments that have been stained by this, but I do believe that it starts with the proximate cause of all this was Prop 64. So if we collectively, and I'm talking local governments too, act as co-plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the state, the money's there. It's in these special trust funds to put the money back in the local governments that were spent on licenses and those who applied and didn't get them, to go ahead and pay back those that have applied and those that had license. Because once Prop 64 SB 94 is done under a writ, then we have to have something else. And our solution is the Restoration Act. But we want to go marching shoulder to shoulder into these lawsuits, or so, this maybe one suit that gets our money back. There's no getting back the time. A lot of us have lost properties, and families have divorced. There's been suicides. I mean, it's just been catastrophic. So I want local government to know that we live in your communities. We live with you. We're not going to hold you accountable. We're going to hold the state accountable. So we're going to go after the state and those special trust funds to refund back what has been lost through the illegal application of Prop 64 SB 94. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah, it's a
they're
big
not the
project.
enemy. They're not the enemy. Even though we might have issues with them on public integrity units and things like that, those are criminal activities that are still going to go on. But from the civil recovery and putting this thing right, that's what I see as the
Well,
best.
you are totally right. Government is not our enemy. We own the government. If we say that government is our enemy, we're saying that we are our own enemy, which would be correct if we're not getting involved. So thank you for bringing up that point, because it's very easy to get that polarized thing of, oh well, I hate government.
It's easier to
It's
focus
mine.
our attention on what's happened at the state level. And this goes back to Edmund Brown, Jerry Brown, and for every attorney general since then. And it finishes with Gavin Newsom. And I don't care if you're left, right, or in the middle. What happened here is they sold us out. And they did so with very confusing language in the proposition, in the initiative, and then further advanced that through the 2/3 supermajority once it had been passed in Senate Bill 94. The nice thing about all that, Debbie, is that the federal government has not wavered one bit since the DEA was created and the Controlled Substance Act was passed or formed in the 70s. That's always been consistent. And international treaties even state that cannabis can be used by member nations for medical and scientific purposes. There's nothing in any of this about adult use. And that's the biggest problem the state's having an issue with getting around. They can't get around it. It is what it is. So I would say that to every local government, all this is your one opportunity to look at this as an opportunity to come together with those licensees and those that you might have not treated quite so fairly, but to get involved in a civil case that returns that money from those special trust funds.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all the information. A lot of it can be put to very good use. And just want to say to folks who've been listening, you've heard how to get to Darryl, and by all means, track down the information. You'll get a great education. And just to let you know again that The Happiest Corruption, Sleaze, Lies, and Suicide in a California Beach Town is available on Amazon. It's available in an ebook version, or you can also get it as a paper book. And thank you for listening today, and have fun getting out there as we the people. Yes, as we the people in our government, by the people, for the people, of the people. And thanks for listening today.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.